One of the cool things about Groundhog Day, I show that in one of my class, in that happiness class that I teach.
Hmm.
And it's an interesting one way of looking at that movie is that Bill Murray's character, Phil Connors, is fortunate to be able to live the same day over and over again, even though it's a kind of purgatory for him. But he's
Hmm.
able to live the same day over and over again so he can experiment with what really makes him happy, right? It's
Hmm.
kind of like he's sort of a scientist.
Three, two, one. Welcome to Love Machine.
Welcome back to Nerding Out with That Nerdy Catholic. I'm That Nerdy Catholic Seth Payne, and we're joined again today with Brent Robbins. Brent Robbins is a professor of psychology. Last week, we talked about his starting into psychology, what got him into that. We talked about his research in joy. And then we also talked a bit about the difference between how he viewed joy before his entry into the Catholic Church, before he became a Christian, and then after, and looking into the role of transcendence in joy. And so today we're going to really focus on that research, on the work that he's done in the area of joy. Brent, it's good to have you back.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me, Seth.
So last week you talked a little bit about the four areas of joy, the four kinds of joy. So why don't you start off with that? What are the four areas of joy, and kind of describe the four of them?
Yeah, so I would say that there's four types of, you might say, visions of the good life is how I would describe
Mm-hmm.
them. That there's the hedonic view, that the way that you become happy, the way that you live a good life is to maximize pleasure and to avoid pain.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, that one is what we're finding is that when people have a kind of hedonic ethic, for example, when they score high on measures of material values, like accumulating
Mm-hmm.
material pleasures is important to them, they tend to be less happy, ironically.
Hmm.
So it tends to be ironically counterproductive. And then there's prudential happiness, which is defined as a engagement with life. So you're engaged in some way. You're immersed, right, in your
Mm-hmm.
life. And that is an interesting one. There does seem to be something about that when people are living a good life that they're very engaged, but there's not a moral dimension to prudential. So you could really be a sociopath and be a very engaged sociopath, and you would meet the
Mm-hmm.
definition of the good life. And I don't think anybody wants to say that sociopaths are living a good life. So that's a problem
Mm-hmm.
with prudential vision of the good life. And then the third one, which goes back to Aristotle and in our own Catholic tradition, St. Thomas Aquinas, the whole concept of eudaimonic happiness as a life of excellence, a life of virtue. And
Mm-hmm.
there's been a real revolution in research in psychology within the past few years. There's kind of an overturning of the hedonic view towards a eudaimonic understanding of happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And that started, I guess, around, I would say, early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
We started to see the shift. Marty Seligman and this guy, Chris Peterson, put together what they called the Handbook of Character Strengths and Virtues. And that started a whole movement toward the study of what sometimes is called psychological well-being, but that's just a term for, eudaimonic well-being. And then a fourth type of well-being is chironic. So chironic vision of the good life is one where you feel blessed, where you feel like life is a gift, a sense of being
Mm-hmm.
fortunate, an openness to the mystery. It evokes feelings of awe, gratitude, uh, appreciation,
Mm-hmm.
and all that is linked to the sense that a good life is a kind of spiritual fruit
Mm-hmm.
of having a spiritual life in a relationship to the transcendent.
When you're looking at that chironic vision of the good life, is that something that is more seen by some by psychologists that have more of a religious background, or is that something that any psychologist would look at and say, okay, well, that this is, there's something here?
Yeah, I think that no, you don't tend to see it very often in more mainstream psychology. That may change because I think the evidence is building in that regard. Where
Mm,
I think you see it among more secular psychologists is within existential and humanistic psychology, which is secular, but it tends to have because of the existential tradition, which is sometimes
mm-hmm,
theistic and sometimes not. There is an interest in experiences of the sublime. You
mm-hmm,
can they go back to Kant and Ed and Burke in their interest in the sublime. In many ways, the
mm-hmm,
humanistic and existential traditions go back to the romantic uh, movement, and some of those ideas. So
mm-hmm,
there's a interest in those kinds of phenomena within
mm-hmm,
humanistic psychology. But humanistic psychology is a bit marginalized within mainstream psychology. It's seen as a bit fringy, So uh, and then maybe you see it in some of the psychology of religion. There are people studying psychology of religion and spirituality, but I've never, and where they
mm-hmm,
might be interested in studying gratitude or maybe even experiences of awe, but they haven't connected them up to a notion of the good life. So the
mm-hmm,
chironic, I do think, is yeah, it's distinctly it's an emerging, I would say, view of the good life, but there's some
mm-hmm,
resistance to it. I just
mm-hmm.
submitted a paper talking about this chironic notion of the good life. And I had one of the comments from the reviewer was like, well, what about atheists? What are they going to do? And I was like, good question.
Uh-huh.
Do atheists have a sense of the transcendent? Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just telling you what the evidence says. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
Atheists can figure out what they want to do with that. That's not my problem.
Yeah. So is there a big pushback looking at that because it's bringing in religious language?
Yeah, yeah. I think that when I did my research, again, I was an atheist when I originally did
Mm-hmm.
my qualitative research on joy and was surprised to find this sort of spiritual language it being used. But that was what participants used. They used language that was the only way to describe it is mystical
Mm-hmm.
kind of language. They're
Mm-hmm.
trying to get they had this just like the people who have mystical experiences. They were talking about how difficult it was to translate those experiences into language. In fact, when I
Mm-hmm.
was originally interviewing people about their experiences of joy, I didn't get very good data because people were really struggling with how to take this experience and put it into words because
Mm-hmm.
they had a hard time doing that. And I think sometimes they felt like it felt awkward and they would get
Mm-hmm.
quiet. And so I found that having them do abstract drawings using color and shape to try to communicate it gave them some license to use like metaphor and analogy
Mm-hmm.
and to be a little bit more playful about how they were trying to speak about that. And that was a perfect intervention because suddenly it was very rich data and people are like, oh, you mean I can use metaphor? I can
Mm-hmm.
invent a kind of language to try to describe this pre-verbal experience. And then
Mm-hmm.
that was again when they did describe it, it was language that was very mystical. So experience of
Mm-hmm.
having a sense of timelessness or the eternal, an
Mm-hmm.
opening onto a transcendence, a
Yeah.
feeling of being. Somebody talked about feeling cradled by the world, being nurtured by the world, like personifying this sort of
Mm-hmm.
transcendent. Not necessarily designated as distinctly divine or God, but it has a sense of that, right? That quality
Yeah.
of a personal relationship. It wasn't, a cold, indifferent world. This was an
Yeah.
experience of a world that was almost aware of them and meeting them in some way in that experience. Was very came
Yeah.
across very clearly.
What I think is really interesting is when you're when you listen to what you just said, if you are someone who came from a very traditional religious, especially Christian background, and you heard someone using that language, I mean, I grew up in a very strong evangelical home
Mm.
before I became Catholic. When I hear what you just said from that perspective, my ears kind of perk up and say, well, that just sounds really new age.
Oh,
And it's
interesting.
this and it sounds like this looking for spirituality outside of this Judeo-Christian tradition,
Hmm.
but from but looking at that from a non-theistic background, you would hear, well, this person is trying to come up with something to make them feel better about themselves or feel
Mm.
more comfortable, that they're looking for something that's not really there.
Hmm.
But what's really interesting is you have people using language that they're not thinking about the religious aspect of it. I'm
No.
sure. But they're looking for language that is describing what's going on, and it's not using the language that we would hear in church,
Right.
but it's approaching that
Right.
in
Right.
language that they understand.
That's right. Yeah. So it's, they're drawing upon language that might, these are not theologians, who thought through
Right.
what they're saying. From a theological perspective, you they could, if you were approaching what they were saying theologically, you might want to clarify, some of the points that
Hmm.
they're making. They're grasping for something
Yeah.
that is more, sort of, it's maybe call it pre-rational. I wouldn't say it's
Hmm.
irrational. It's
Hmm.
pre-rational. They haven't clearly articulated that experience yet. They're
Hmm.
trying to formulate it. You can
Yeah.
turn to philosophy, you can turn to theology and go, okay, here's what's going on here, and then begin to clarify that. And that's sort of
Hmm.
what some of my work has been, is going back and looking at this data and then reading philosophy, reading theology, and then trying to say, okay,
Hmm.
what's going on here?
And it's contrary to what you were expecting when you first started studying this. As you
Right.
said, last time, you were expecting to see people using language that would really center their experiences around their own selves, around their own bodies, and they're
Right.
reaching out beyond themselves.
Right. Yeah, I thought people would be, the pleasure would be more, self-focused, right? And like the feeling the pleasure in their bodies in some way, the joy, the feelings of joy within the body. And
Hmm.
but there was that. They talked about this feeling of warmth moving up and out of the body, but it was all about this opening up towards an other, toward a
Hmm.
transcendent other.
Hmm.
And so in that sense, it had a very, they started using language that sounded very, very mystical. I don't think, I mean, some maybe talking in ways that might sound a little pantheistic or something like that.
Hmm.
If that's maybe where the New Age feeling might come from. I think there's some of that. Yeah, some of that kind
Hmm.
of is when they're talking about a transcendent God. Are they talking about a God that's sort of immanent, that
Hmm.
or a kind of like Gaia type of, the
Hmm.
world is like a divine being or something like that.
Hmm.
It depends on the person you talk to. I think they're
Right.
grasping for language that they know, that might be familiar with them, maybe from their own spiritual background or things that they've heard from other people, to
Yeah.
try to formulate what they're saying. But it's not worked out very carefully in some
Right.
theological sense. So
It makes me think of, and I'm blanking on where this is in scripture, but the passage that says, we have eternity written on our hearts.
hmm,
That there is that without even understanding, you're not. I think there are a lot of people that see religious experience as something that you only have because you go to some religious group.
right,
And
right,
until you are exposed to this religious group, you're having, all of your experiences are in your mind or in yourself, like what you were expecting people to
hmm,
be talking about. But you have people experiencing a transcendent um, without knowing what to call it, right?
right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting because you can even look to developmental research. There's been a lot of research over the past 10, 20 years that have really called into question this idea that people sort of are born sort of atheists, like the blank slate.
Mm-hmm.
If you go
Yeah.
back to like John Locke, we're not blank slates. We're born with
Mm-hmm.
certain predispositions, and one of those we're starting to find is a predisposition to theism.
Mm-hmm.
Look, using really creative research in developmental psychology, but from a very early age, children seem to be disposed to perceive agency, in the universe, in
Mm-hmm.
beyond them, and also from a very early age. Oh, by the way, this is even with parents that are atheists. They're finding this in children, and a disposition to believe in that they're eternal, that their soul is immortal, is very
Mm-hmm.
ubiquitous. You see that in children who aren't raised in religious families, even in those with parents who don't believe in an afterlife. And we've even done some interesting research where if you have an atheist perform certain tasks that would that might imply that there's sort of a perception of a creator or agency behind events. Normally, they would, if they're don't have a high cognitive load and they're conscious of what they're doing, they would deny that. But if
Mm-hmm.
you create high cognitive load, if you have them doing multiple tasks and you present information very quickly, then
Mm-hmm.
even atheists will default to more theistic ways of understanding things.
Mm-hmm.
So that seems to imply that atheism or agnosticism is kind of a, requires a kind of higher cognitive
Hmm.
denial of something that's more innate. And I
Hmm.
think that research evidence supports that.
I feel like I've read this before. People talking about a God gene, that there that there's something in our genetics, as you said, it disposes us
Right.
to look for something beyond ourselves. And what I think is really interesting about that is the more that I learn about the study of the sciences, and I've read a few great books recently hitting on this idea. There's some people that want to be able to prove God through science, and there's some people that want to disprove God through science, but realizing that God is completely transcendent above us and cannot be proved or disproved through science. But people can look at this disposition for the transcendent, the disposition for this understanding that there's something beyond us. And one person can say, well, that's just proof that all that we see about God is just in our head.
Right.
But then there's someone else. Yeah, but then there's someone else that can look at that and say, well, this is proof that God created us and wired us up to know him.
Right. It's when I do have a lot of conversations with atheists and agnostics. I belong to several groups where theists and agnostics debate each other.
Mm-hmm.
It's people who like to debate. Sometimes there's just a lot of trolls in some of these places,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes you can get some really good dialogue, and I learn a lot about
Mm-hmm.
how atheists and agnostics think. And I brought this up in the groups, and generally the atheists tend to point out, and quite rightly, that what sometimes is referred to as a hyper agency detector. Like this, we're born with this. They would say, well, you can explain that from the perspective of evolutionary theory, and say that
Mm-hmm.
we evolved to perceive agency because if something's moving in the weeds over there, it could be some agent that's going to eat you, and if you're biased toward detecting
Right.
that, then that's going to enhance your survival. And yeah, well, of course, I wouldn't deny that. But that doesn't mean that God couldn't, if there is a God, right, which we believe, that God couldn't, use an evolutionary process to implant an idea of him in us.
Yeah.
You can take that in either direction. But yeah, science is not equipped to prove theism. It's God
Mm-hmm.
is transcendent of his creation, and that you can't do an experiment where you're like, okay, let's create a world that's without God and see if it's different than the world with God. And, it would be cool if we could, but it would be if we could manipulate God as an experimental variable, then it wouldn't be God. We might be studying something, but it wouldn't be God.
Well, either that or that would make us God. And
Right, exactly. We'd have to be God in order to do that. Yeah. So I
Yeah.
think that atheists kind of use that to their advantage, right? Because they'll say, well, if you can't prove that God exists empirically, then God does not exist. But if you are able to demonstrate a God who can be, if you're able to demonstrate proof of a God that's open to empirical testing, then it wouldn't be God.
Right.
So it's a catch-22.
Right.
And so what I tended to point out is that science really, in so many ways, presupposes an orderly universe, and there's no reason to presuppose that without belief in God.
Why isn't it just random, completely random?
Yeah.
Right.
In fact, that's a much more, if you're completely open-minded without any presuppositions, any metaphysical presuppositions, your default presupposition would be like just look around you. Things seem pretty chaotic a lot of the time. Not very orderly, certainly not law-like, right? If you look at how people behave, so we have plenty of reasons to say that things are very unpredictable and chaotic. And if you look to polytheistic, pagan traditions, that's generally how they view the world. I mean, why look for laws in the universe when
Hmm.
you're just dealing with a capricious God, the God of the ocean or the God of the sun or whatever God you're dealing with. There, depends on their mood that day,
Yeah, they woke up
and
on the
whether
wrong side of the
you've,
bed, and they're going to have bring a big storm.
yeah. I watched the Clash of the Titans, that old 1981 version, with my
Uh huh.
son because he's learning about Greek mythology,
Uh
and
huh.
how the whole story is like is I think it's Zeus and I'm trying to remember which of the other gods he's. I think is it Zeus and Athena are sort of battling it out, because he Odysseus is his son and he's jealous because
Hmm.
the whole thing is that these gods at war with each other, and the poor
Yeah.
Odysseus caught in the middle of it.
Yeah.
That's how they perceive the world. It was not an orderly world. You wouldn't look for laws, universal
Yeah.
laws, in a world like that. You need
Yeah.
a monotheism, where you have
Yeah.
one logos. So it doesn't make. So I think, and I have had conversations with intellectually honest atheists and agnostics who acknowledge, yeah, okay, that you seem to be right, that it seems to be a metaphysical set of presuppositions that maybe are necessary to give birth to our understanding of
Hmm.
science and the search for universal knowledge. But once we get there, then we can dispense with all that superstition.
And going back to we were talking about that, there are people that will say, well, you can't prove that God exists, and so
Right.
therefore let's just not even worry about him and think about him. And unfortunately, there are people out there that say, no, 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 I can prove that God exists, and here's why, and they'll come up with this list. But in a way, they're kind of playing into the hand of the atheist to say that I can prove God exists, because then they're just getting into this argument of can or can't you prove that God exists. But then you go back to your experience, the experience you had on your retreat, and you weren't convinced because of some argument that God exists. You had an experience of God, and that is what brought you in.
Right.
So talk about that, about how you talk about psychology and joy and all the stuff that you're working on, as a way to talk about our experience with God, but then realizing that it's going to take some mystical experience
Right.
for someone to say, oh, okay, now I get it. Now I see
Yeah.
that God
I
is out
would.
there.
I don't think I could have reasoned my way to the faith that I have now.
Hmm.
That reason alone, might have got me. I think I would maybe be open to something that was more kind of a deism, maybe,
Hmm.
at best, from using purely reason. And I found that's been my experience too. I mean, there's some great arguments for theism. I mean,
Hmm.
the four proofs from Aquinas. But Plantinga's stuff, his more recent ontological version of the ontological argument, sort of a revival of Anselm, I think is a very powerful argument.
Hmm.
Lonergan's argument from intelligibility, the way it's developed by Robert Spitzer in his book, the cosmological argument. There's some really powerful intellectual that are very intellectually satisfying. But I
Hmm.
find that I don't think any of those would have been, you know what I mean? I would have been like pretty skeptical, been like,
Hmm.
it's like it's an intellectual trick of some kind, It's kind
Yeah.
of how I might have thought about it. And that's kind of how I've experienced it when I've used those kind of intellectual arguments. Like again, the atheists that I talk to love to debate those kind of
Hmm.
arguments. And rarely have I seen anybody go, "Oh, well, I've read Plantinga's ontological argument. Now I'm a theist." You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
It's more like something that people go back to try to reconcile. I think their intellectual experience with
Hmm.
something that's more mystical. So that's kind of what happened to me. Is
Hmm.
I was still very much a skeptic, and then I had this experience which can only be described as mystical, and I just couldn't deny it. It was like
Hmm.
seeing an apple in front of you and saying, yeah, there's an apple there. And somebody saying, no, it's
Hmm.
not. And you're like, no, I see the apple. I can't deny it. I can hold it, I can touch it, I
Yeah.
can taste it. It's real. And that was the kind of experience that I had, and so it was, I think that that's true. And I think it's also theologically, it's important, because, within the tradition of Catholicism, but also in most versions of Protestantism, faith is a gift. It's not something you can
Hmm.
kind of work your way to intellectually.
Mm-hmm.
It may be there, a disposition to it, but you could argue that as a consequence of the fall, we're very cut off. We can become very cut off from that disposition
Mm-hmm.
and distant from it and numb to it. You might say
Yeah.
numb to that call with it that's in our true nature, and that it's really a gift. It requires God's grace and intervention to
Mm-hmm.
open us up to His. That there's a personal God. That there's not just sort of deistic God who sort of wound up the clock and then let it run
Yeah.
and then went about his own way. But this is a God who is intimate with us and deeply involved with us all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, every hair on our head, right, as it says in Scripture. That
Yeah.
kind of God is very hard to just reason your way to. It requires a kind of not irrationality, but a kind of super
Yeah.
rationality. Your reason takes you so far, and then the faith takes you to the grace that gives you that faith takes you to the next level. And that's really what I experienced. What I think is really interesting is since that experience, I felt that I've become, my theories and my psychology has become more rational, not less rational. I had
Mm-hmm.
begun to lose faith in science, right? I
Mm-hmm.
became sort of a bit of an existential, postmodern nihilist, you know what I mean? Thinking that it's all socially constructed, because it was this idea, why should we assume that anything is orderly? And
Yeah.
and there's all these debates, and science is always coming up with these conclusions, and then they get overturned. Thomas Kuhn wrote that famous book, The Nature of Scientific Revolutions. His whole point was that science isn't really cumulative.
Mm-hmm.
We build up a worldview using empirical evidence, and then anomalies, things that don't fit that, build up over time, and everybody tries to ignore them, and then they accumulate so
Mm-hmm.
much that people can't ignore them anymore, and the whole worldview shifts, and then all the old facts have no relevance anymore. It's all just thrown out like phlogiston in the
Yeah.
history of physics. And
Yeah.
if that's what science is, then why are we even bothering?
Right.
What's the point? It's pointless. The whole
Right.
point of doing science is to arrive at universal, eternal, truth, universal truth,
Mm-hmm.
at least within the physical universe or within human
Yeah.
behavior. And so I was bought into that, a very social constructionist, kind of historicist reading of science. And so I had really kind of even lost faith in science. And I see that in a lot of my colleagues too.
Mm.
Some people do not. There are some people that are, scientistic, right? That
Mm-hmm.
science kind of becomes a replacement for faith in an odd way.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes a kind of metaphysics, which is not what science is supposed to be. It's not a metaphysical materialism. It's a empirical inquiry. But so there's that whole problem. But I think if you keep going down that road, you're really intellectually honest, you end up in this kind of skepticism and nihilism. And that's kind of where I was. And since I started, going back and reading Aquinas and understanding the history of psychology and how it emerges really very early on, starting in the 12th, 13th, 14th century. And it begins with this metaphysical understanding of, an orderly universe, that reason begins to make sense within that metaphysical framework. As soon as you take that metaphysical framework away, this is why my atheist friends, I disagree with them. I don't think we can just do away with, okay, the metaphysical assumptions got us to this idea of science, and now we can just get rid of them. I think if we get rid of them, it's like pulling out the chair from under the whole thing.
Right. Well, if you get rid of them, then what are you going to study?
Right. But, it's the positivism is a real big problem there, because positivism has convinced people that anytime you talk about metaphysics, that's just bunk and nonsense. And so all we need to do is, as if they're not doing metaphysics. There's all kinds of metaphysical presuppositions. They're just unexamined metaphysical presuppositions.
There's the meme out there where you see, I'm going to butcher this, I'm sure, but there's one guy who's like, well, you do philosophy and I'm going to do science. And then the other guy goes, well, why do you study science? And he says, I'm studying science because, and the other guy goes, well, you're doing philosophy.
Right.
Right. We all have a philosophy. There is a tendency for people to want to say, well, I'm going to study the facts.
Right.
And and it's the facts that matter. And you're over there doing philosophy, trying to figure out why things are.
Right.
But I just want to study the facts, and I'm not going to worry about philosophy. But you're still no, you can't. The way we're wired with philosophy, right? We can't do anything without having a philosophy behind it.
Yeah, it's you either have a a philosophy that you're aware of, or you have a philosophy that you're unaware of? Which of those is the
Hmm.
better? Obviously the one that you're aware of and that you're thinking self-critically about. A lot of
Yeah.
people who are scientistic, who thinks philosophy doesn't have anything to teach us, or they just aren't aware that. I mean, empirical epistemology comes out of philosophy, comes out of
Hmm.
John Locke and David Hume, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's full of all kinds of philosophical presuppositions. When people say, "Oh, I'm just studying facts," well, to delineate a construct of interest that you're studying requires you to define what it is.
Hmm.
So like what in my study of joy, part of what I was trying to understand was even prior to before you can go out and measure something, you have to understand what it
Hmm.
is. So I was
Yeah.
trying to understand, well, what is joy? That's basically a metaphysical kind of question. It's a question of
Yeah.
essence. What is the essence of something? That's why I was doing a phenomenological approach, because it answers those kinds of essence questions. So
Hmm.
once I got that, then I could develop a measure, a quantitative measure, and I could see, when people score high on joy, they scored high on gratitude, and they scored high
Yeah.
in awe, and
Yeah.
that they were happier, they had higher subjective well-being. But I had to define what it was first, and that it's those moments that's what gets skipped over. People just, a lot of times in psychology, but I think in science in general, it's like they sit around with their graduate students, in their research labs, and they just define things, and they
Hmm.
think that that's science, but no, it's not. It's a pre-empirical. As soon as you define something, if you say this is what's physical and this is what's non-physical, this is real,
Yeah.
that's not real. As soon as you're doing that, you're engaged in metaphysics. I mean,
Yeah.
the all of physics. You go back to Galileo, and he makes that distinction between primary and secondary objects, where what's within the domain of physics is what can be quantifiable. And he thought that was basically just two qualities: extension, how much things take up space, and movement,
Hmm.
because you can quantify those things.
Hmm.
And then, well, what about everything else? What about morality and values and aesthetics? Well, those are
Hmm.
all secondary qualities. They're dependent on the observer, including
Hmm.
sensory experience. And then that's the birth of psychology, because then we're like, okay, well, how does this stuff in here get experienced out there, and how does the stuff out there
Yeah.
get experienced in here? It becomes this whole
Yeah.
subject object problem that
Yeah.
laboratory psychology comes along and tries to fix,
Yeah.
mend.
And we're trying to figure out all of the stuff out there by just studying what's in here, right?
Right,
Right.
exactly. That's a big problem. I think that whole primary secondary quality distinction that Galileo makes is was important in a certain sense for him, because we all know one
Hmm.
of the problems with Galileo, what got him into trouble, is he had a tendency to wander outside of his domain into
Hmm.
theology.
Yeah. Yeah.
And nobody would have minded if he had just done science, but he kept wanting to draw theological conclusions from his science, and that's
Hmm.
where he tended to get into hot water.
Yeah.
But I think in a certain sense, when the value of restricting, kind of bracketing all other qualities except what's measurable, is that it does allow you to do things. You develop a
Hmm.
kind of mechanical philosophy that gives you some power. You can send somebody to the moon doing
Hmm.
that, and then bring them
Yeah.
back again, right?
Yeah.
So mechanical philosophy is cool, but then you reduce everything to mechanism and assume that that's what reality is, and you and I we're just machines. And then
Just a bunch of atoms.
Descartes tries to bring the ghost back into the machine. But if that's all we are, a bunch of atoms, then we're back to
Yeah.
what Viktor Frankl calls the existential vacuum. That's where I was.
Yeah.
That was where I was as an atheist. I believed that. I thought that all qualities were just things, electrochemical stuff in our brain, and that when we die, it was all going to go away. Like at the end of
Hmm.
Blade Runner, what's the name of the Rutger Hauer's character? It's all going to go away, like
Oh.
tears in the rain.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that was kind of how I thought about it. The
Yeah.
set kind of melancholy about it. Wanting, wishing. There's a despair in that,
Yeah.
an inability to hope.
Yeah.
That is a real serious problem. I think it's a big problem with our youth today. Getting back to psychology, there's a high rates of depression and anxiety in our
Hmm.
youth, and I think a lot of that has to do with metaphysics. Ironically, people believe that nothing is real. They doubt
Hmm.
everything. There's a kind of, Viktor Frankl called it existential vacuum, right? This sort of
Hmm.
emptiness in
Hmm.
at the heart of our assumptions about reality. that
Yeah.
is really not a way to build a life, and certainly not a way to find joy in
Yeah.
life.
I think it's really interesting then that you are studying joy from a psychological viewpoint, because here is something, as Catholics, we realize that we need meaning. We need
Hmm.
purpose. God created us to find purpose and meaning in our life, to find joy. But if you try to talk to someone who doesn't believe in God, you can't say, well, this is what God wants for you, but they're going to say, well, I don't believe in God, so why would I even think about that?
Right.
But if you can talk about joy from a psychological perspective and use that language,
Right.
that can be a doorway into having someone say, oh, maybe there is something transcendent. And here's someone that's speaking, who's not trying to throw religious language at me, but is saying something that I can more relate to. He's talking about really studying it from a scientific perspective, but he's still pointing at something transcendent.
Yeah, I think this going back to we were talking about Groundhog Day in my last episode that had an influence on me. And one of the cool things about Groundhog Day, I show that in one of my in that happiness class that I teach.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an interesting one way of looking at that movie is that Bill Murray's character Phil Connors is fortunate to be able to live the same day over and over again, even though it's a kind of purgatory for him, But he's
Mm-hmm.
able to live the same day over and over again, so he can experiment with what really makes him happy, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like he's sort of a scientist, right?
Yeah.
Every day he tries out something different. In the beginning, he's like it's a hedonic version of happiness. So he
Mm-hmm.
eats all the food that he wants, and he does everything he
Yeah.
wants to do.
Oh, that's
He's
that scene where he's stuffing that cake into his mouth.
right. He's stuffing. Yeah, he's stuffing all that stuff in his mouth. That's the hedonic
Mm-hmm.
vision of the good life, and that fails.
Mm-hmm.
Try it if you want. I did. I got fat.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically what happened to me. It did make me happy. It made me unhealthy,
Mm-hmm.
if anything. And people tend to take risks that they don't need to make when they're just following hedonic vision of happiness. It's not a healthy lifestyle. It doesn't make you
Mm-hmm.
happy. And anybody who lives that life of pleasure, I think, tends to, and desire immediate gratification, kind of comes
Mm-hmm.
to that point. Drug addiction is maybe the most obvious example of that. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
what better way to achieve immediate gratification and hedonic happiness than using cocaine? Because you're
Mm-hmm.
literally directly stimulating your nucleus accumbens, which is the pleasure center in the brain. The only
Mm-hmm.
way that you could have a more direct influence on your nucleus accumbens would be like putting an electrode in your nucleus accumbens and a button attached to it, which is how
Mm-hmm.
they've studied addiction doing that with mice. And but is that what happiness is? Pressing your nucleus
Mm-hmm.
accumbens all day? That's pretty pathetic
Yeah.
life,
Yeah.
right? And so people obviously would want more. They don't want pleasure to just be this feeling. They want it to be about something that
Mm-hmm.
actually is good, like something that transcends mere feeling or immediate gratification. So what does Phil do? Well, now he tries to win this girl,
Mm-hmm.
this woman, and when that fails, he for a while there he also decides he's going to do it through liberty, right? Through freedom, emancipation from the law. So he flouts the
Mm-hmm.
law. Remember, he goes into prison. Then he
Mm-hmm.
wakes up the next day. He's free of prison. He's like, I can do anything.
Yeah.
Well, that doesn't make him happy either. So all these things that we're taught in our culture in different ways will make us happy. Don't make Phil happy. What makes him happy is first he goes through an ego death, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just through this repetitive suicide. You can sort of interpret that as a kind of ego death, and then he comes out on the other side, and he's altruistic. He's
Mm-hmm.
looking. He's saying, okay, I'm going to try a different approach. I'm going to try to better myself through creative endeavors, right? He
Mm-hmm.
becomes ice sculpture. He learns to play piano. But he
Mm-hmm.
also says, I'm going to be there. I'm going to be someone who is going to give myself to others. I'm going to
Yeah.
gift my time, my day. He's helping the old ladies with their tire, and
Mm-hmm.
he's
Yeah.
helping the little boy who falls from the tree. And the real transformative moment is when he discovers that homeless man dies at the end of the day, the
Mm-hmm.
guy who he refused to give a donation to. So
Yeah.
takes him to the diner and feeds him
Yeah.
a
Does
big
whatever he can
meal.
to save him.
Yeah, and I think so. I think what that tells us, there's an encounter with mortality, an awareness of a finitude and a desire for the transcendent, and
Mm-hmm.
out of that comes this abundant what I would call fecundity. This
Hmm.
idea that I have something to give, right, to other
Yeah.
people, and I want to give that to people. And that's out of that comes this sense of belonging, at homeness, community, in the sense of security, well-being, and a lot of that is an expression of love. So I'm really interested now in how there seems to be a close relationship between a kind of agapic uh, love and experiences of joy as well.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that is a good place to wrap up this episode. Thank you so much again, Brent, for joining me.
My pleasure.
I'm looking forward to having you back talking more about joy. And I think there are a lot of different conversations that we can have looking at this concept of looking at the transcendent from the perspective of psychology and seeing where our minds can interact with the world that God created, and a way to use that language of psychology to show people that there is something beyond us,
Hmm.
right?
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's a lot to talk about. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
I'm glad I have an opportunity to be back because there's so
yeah,
much to unpack here and so many directions we could go.
yeah.
It's a great. I love the whole concept of your podcast. So
Mm.
I'm gonna be definitely nerding out on your podcast on
Awesome,
a regular basis.
awesome.
Not of course I'm not gonna watch myself. That would be boring. But listening to other people and learning new things.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining me, Brent, and thank you for joining me on another Nerding Out. I look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.
Take care.
System shut down.